AoE has always been something that's been a staple in the Splatoon series, whether it be through entire weapon classes, subs, or specials. It's always been there. Today I wanted to take a further look into how it's handled and discuss whether I think it's handled well or not. So first, let's talk about what AoE is. AoE is basically when there's a damage radius or hitbox that deals damage within a certain area. In Splatoon, it usually comes in your kit, even having entire weapon classes dedicated to it, most notably rollers, brushes, sloshers, and especially blasters, of course. In Splatoon 3, at the very least, AoE has always played some sort of part in the meta, and select AoE weapons, mainly rollers and blasters, being consistently at the top of the tier list. But there's more to talk about with specials that use AoE, with a few honorable mentions being Trizooka, Reef Slider, Crab Tank in its second fire, and Inkjet. But that's enough of that, let's start breaking it down. So to begin, I want to go back to my claim that AoE tools in Splatoon usually have some sort of part in the meta. In Splatoon 3 at the very least, but I can think of some in the other two games. However, I can at least say that this has been the case since the beginning of Splatoon 3, whether it be through specials like Crab or Inkjet, or weapons like Range Blaster and S-Blast. There has always been some sort of AoE weapon in the meta. Now that begs the question, since this is a trend, does that mean that all AoE weapons are always good and broken? Not necessarily. What I mean by that is that there are some AoE weapons that are good by nature, while others struggle to keep up. But usually the reason that those weapons struggle to keep up is not inherently because of their AoE being poor, but rather because the other factors are underpowered. Let's use Clash Blaster for example. So it's a blaster with a large radius and a high fire rate, so why isn't it considered good? Well, the damage is only good when you hit it direct, which is difficult because of the weapon's poor accuracy, and the paint the weapon produces is horrid. Compare this to Range Blaster, which has a smaller radius, slower fire rate, but it works better paired with more options than Clash. It has good damage and fair paint for what it does. Now, at first, AoE kinda sounds like a broken idea, so it's important that thought is put into making these AoE tools in online games. For example, this is kind of a shameless plug, but in my own project, we made an ability called Firework Launcher that would, well, shoot fireworks with an AoE explosion. But at the start, it had a massive radius that was basically impossible to dodge, and it took 2 separate patches to finally get it to a somewhat healthy spot. Now let's move back to Splatoon. I've discussed the balance history of AoE in a previous video already, but I'll overview what I said about balancing these tools properly. With AoE weapons, you want to make sure that they're enjoyable to go against for everyone playing the game. Too small of an AoE could lead to the weapon being perceived as not good, but too big of a radius may lead to more casual players not finding enjoyment in going against it. So if I'm going to be honest, for most cases, it would be healthier if they didn't mess with the actual AoE part while balancing it and rather choose other attributes of the weapon to buff slightly, which I think is a better approach. However, Nintendo hasn't had the best track record of doing that for the AoE tools in Splatoon 3, so if you want to hear me talk about that, I highly recommend checking out the video I mentioned earlier where I go into depth into the situation. But I'm trying not to waste too much of your time here, so it's time to get into my favorite part of the video, community reputation. Now, some of you might already know where I'm going with this, but I decided to include this because I thought it was interesting. So, AoE is often described as something that requires no skill or no aim, because you don't always have to directly hit someone for it to deal damage. From what I've seen, the most mentioned AoE tools are S-Blast 91, rollers like Splat Roller and Carbon Roller, and specials like Trizooka, though it's not talked about as much anymore, but it was the center of a huge discussion previously, as a lot of you may know. Now, I don't think using AoE requires no skill at all. In fact, weapons like Range Blaster and specials like Inkjet are extremely difficult to play correctly. I'd even argue that Carbon Roller is exceedingly difficult, specifically at higher levels of play where everyone can deal with shirking playstyles more effectively, which is something that players will find more difficult to deal with at lower levels. However, I will admit that some AoE tools are easier than others, and I won't say any names. That doesn't make them completely free, because in reality, nothing is. Now, because of all this, AoE tools aren't inherently broken by any means. There are a lot more factors that tie into something being good or not. It'll never just be one thing most of the time. This is the reality that we are in because of the way the devs balance them. For example, blasters being worse while they're being rushed down because it's harder for them to hit their AoE shots in close proximity. So to conclude, AoE in Splatoon is definitely here to stay, which in most cases is a good thing. I believe that some of the AoE tools in the game could have been handled a bit better, but there's a reason that AoE isn't just straight up the meta, or at least that's not the whole picture. I think there is a trend where newer players struggle to deal with this kind of stuff, but it just comes down to getting better awareness over time and learning how to play around it. If you enjoyed, be sure to leave a like, subscribe so that I might be able to stay relevant, and have a good one.